to hear what was about. So, in case you haven't heard of Growing Up in Science before, it is a place for academic scientists to reflect on life as a scientist, on struggles, failures, insecurities, what makes us human as scientists, and also academic practice and very often malpractice. In many places, Growing Up in Science takes the form of a talk series. They started at New York University and has spread all over the world. People have different formats for this. If you would like to hear more about that, go to the website growingupinscience.com. Usually in these talk series, there's a single speaker who tells their life story with an emphasis on the things that they struggled with. So this format that we're doing today is a new one, where we solicited questions from the wider world, and we're hoping to shed some light on those. It's a new concept, and we'd love to hear what you think. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. They were amazing questions. We in fact have now enough material for multiple events. So if this goes well, that's likely going to happen. Thank you also very much if you took the time to vote for these questions. We got, I think, about 100 people who expressed how interested they were in particular questions. We have used those votes as a guide, but also pick questions that we had something to say about personally. You can continue to submit questions after this event. Find the submission link on the website, and who knows, that we'll discuss your question in a future event. If we are discussing a question today and you have something to say about it, maybe you want to share your own experience, maybe you don't agree with something that Yael or I say, then please use the chat. We will be monitoring the chat. As I said before, you can change your name to anonymous just by going to participants, finding your own name, clicking on more, and then rename if you feel more comfortable expressing your opinion anonymously. As time allows, we will read from the chat and address your comments and further questions. After the event, you can respond to the things that we said by using the same question submission link that's on the website. So without further ado, we'll start with the first question for today. This is from a finishing PhD student, and their question is, I'm going to just read it. It's about PhD students receiving guidance on deciding and planning what to do after they graduate. From my experience as a finishing PhD student and talking to my peers, there's maybe an informal discussion about next steps once or twice a year, and very minimal guidance from most advisors navigating this decision process. Sometimes this is a conscious choice because an advisor believes their guidance will push their student in a certain direction, or believe they can't help if the student is looking for a future outside the traditional academic route. Regardless of the student's decision, I believe it could be better. As a student, you work for years on your relationship with your advisor. Why can't this not be a part of it? So my question is, how can we make sure students get the emotional and practical guidance for navigating next steps after graduation? So I completely agree. This should be part of a good advisor-advisee relationship. If you are responsible for somebody's career, that it doesn't just include getting papers out, it also includes talking to them about future options. I've tried to do that in my lab quite extensively. In my lab, one of the very common dilemmas is whether to continue as a postdoc or to find a job in data science. So the skills that people in my lab usually leave with makes them quite competitive for careers in industry. And it's hard to judge. It's apples and oranges. And it's definitely, if you're in that situation, you want to get guidance from lots of people, including your advisor. Now, it's true that many advisors only have experience with the academic route. So maybe it's actually true that they don't have that much to say about the alternatives. And maybe a little bit less generously, maybe they're overly negative about those alternatives because they have their own biased view. So if you're in that situation, I would definitely cast a wide net in terms of who you ask for advice. So you could ask friends who have gone into other professions, and I'm not just talking about industry, it's also government or non-profits or education or editing. So there are lots of alternative careers that you just don't hear very much about. Now, some really good institutions, they have professional guidance on this, right? They might have coordinators for a program who organize events that focus on career options and bring in speakers from different professions. And together that can give a much richer view than just what you can get from your advisor. In some cases, it's possible to do an internship. So in the programs that I'm part of, internships are allowed, in some cases even encouraged. So that could be the summer during your second or third year, where you check out an internship in a company just to see what it's like, because you can talk to as many people as you want. There's no substitute for actually experiencing it. So like in summary, I would say that even if your advisor is not that willing to talk about these things, there will be other people who are very willing to talk about it. And sometimes these are other professors, sometimes they're peers, sometimes they're people who already walked different routes. Now you have a bigger problem if your advisor is actively against going into a different direction. And maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about that later. But that will require a whole different set of considerations. Yael, did you?
Yeah, I can add a couple of things. One thing is there's this idea when you're looking for mentorship and for guidance on anything, to go and ask someone who has what you want. And that relates to the issue of if you want to know mostly about options outside academia, maybe your mentor in academia is not the right person to ask anyway. Even if they were very comfortable about talking to it, their advice is not the advice that's most helpful for you. So think about what options you are interested in and just go to talk to people who have that. And one good way to do this is look at previous graduates from your own lab. They had the same kind of training that you have. Not all of them have stayed in academia. I guarantee there's not a single lab that I know that everybody has stayed in academia. And so you could just get in touch with them, especially if they're already on the website. You can find their email, get in touch with them, ask them, you know, what do they think about their job right now, and how did they go about that? So I think that's a really good source of information. The other thing that I wanted to add is actually there's another part of this. We've been focusing on what if you want information that your advisor can't give you. I think there's a lot of information that your advisor can give you about staying in academia. For instance, finding a postdoc. So I had a situation where one of my students, when they graduated, well, they were co-advised. So in their last year, they weren't really working with me that much. So I didn't have my finger kind of on the tap on this. And then like 2 weeks before the defense, I find out that this student has not talked to the other advisor that they've been working with for more than a year about where would they go for a postdoc. And they kind of felt that it's all on them. Like, you have to find a postdoc on your own. That is like, none of us manage in academia on our own. And just throwing around names, like, what do you know about these labs? Do you think this person would work well with me or not? Your advisor knows a lot about people in the field, has sometimes very strong views about people in the field, so take everything with a grain of salt. But also they're in a really good position to send someone an email and say, hey, my awesome student is looking for a postdoc. Do you have any openings? And that can just, you know, your email, we get so many emails from people looking for any kind of jobs. Your email can fall by the wayside just because the person is overwhelmed. Or even I've had the opposite happen. I read an email, it's very relevant. The person is very relevant. So I don't, you know, the easy answers is, sorry, I don't have any open positions. But this is a harder answer, which is maybe I will, let's look at the timeline, blah, blah, blah. So I think to myself, I'll answer that later. And literally 4 months later, I suddenly have like, oh my goodness, I never answered that person.
All the time.
This has happened more than once, right? So, so so your advisor, it's not that, you know, nobody cares about you, they only care about your advisor, but another little ping from the advisor, or in the case of this person in my lab, it ended up that I met someone at a conference that I know for many years, that I knew that they were interested in their lab. I saw this person at a conference and I was like, hey, you know, my student is really interested in your lab, and now the student is in that lab. So, you know, one little conversation can make a big difference, because they didn't have an opening at that time, but you know, you can convince that this person is worth making an opening for. So so I had asked that student, why didn't you come to me and say, you know, can let's talk about postdocs? And the student said, well, I thought that was on me, that wasn't your job. So it is our job. It's totally your advisor's job to help you with your future career choices, whatever they are. I know that some advisors, you can't talk to them freely about options outside of academia. I'm not naive. I know that some of them really frown on that. So in that case, you have to, you know, talk to other people, but it's totally our job to help you. And you know, we can't always keep track of everything. So we might kind of wait for you to initiate it, but please, please do, because we're really, really happy to help, and can very easily help in many situations. But it's sometimes harder to just keep track of remembering what we need to help each person with. So what I say to my to people in my lab now is, I can help you with any problem that you put on the table. Please just put it on the table, because I'm not really good at digging out the problems that are not on the table. Just too much stuff, too many balls in the air.
I completely agree, Yael. I would like to go to some of the comments in the chat. So one is Weissenhaus, and Weissenhaus is saying, part of the issue here is on the culture within the mentor class, where students leaving the academic track is viewed as a failure of their mentorship. Julia is going on along the same lines, like, what if the mentor is not supportive of the students' continuation? Sorry, that's the opposite, actually, not supportive of the students' continuation in academia. Those are two very different questions. So as to the first comment, I think that's an incredibly outdated view. That might be, to some extent, justified in the 70s, where there was a shortage of academics and you could just get a faculty position straight out of grad school, and you just had to have a powerful advisor who would place one phone call. Those times are gone, right? So these days, realistic advisors know that only a very small proportion of their trainees is going to continue in academia, and everybody else is absolutely not a failure. In many cases, that's actually their preferred option. And it's absolutely the job of the advisors to support their trainees in whatever direction they go. Now, in part, this is just a matter of all the generation retiring, these kinds of ideas, outdated ideas, slowly disappearing. Now, that might not help you personally, but as we said, it's definitely, you will be able to find other faculty who have a more understanding and a more open-minded view, and you can just have a confidential conversation with them, and they can become your informal advisor on these matters.
Also, I should say that the Growing Up in Science series, if you have it in your institution, and if not, you can try to initiate it there. It was really useful in my institution to see that many of our faculty had different careers before that. Certainly not everybody, but there are people who have had other experience, and I think they are more open to discussing their own experience. I mean, I had a job in industry before I was an academic, so I'm always happy to help with advice on that. But also that kind of shows that at least some people they have to be open to the fact that that's a possibility for you too. I mean, that's a possibility that they chose. They did that same search on the way. So it helps to know people's history. Even I guess we don't put it in our CVs. We don't put our previous jobs in our CVs. So you can't really know except through things like Growing Up in Science, where you hear someone's story.
Yeah, absolutely. There's several useful tips in the chat, so I would encourage you to check those out. Julia, your question we're going to touch upon in connection to a later question. Okay, so I suggest we move to the next question. Yael, do you want to?
Sure. So I'm a postdoc, and I don't know if I want to have a lab in the future, but I want to keep doing research. But there's no career path for just doing research forever. What should I do? So this is a question that we discuss a lot in my lab. I have a lot to say about it, and time is short today, so I won't say everything. I have this, like, fear of, the opposite of fear of missing out, fear of forgetting out. I don't know. But basically, I think this is a really important decision to make. And it's really important, and that might sound trivial, but it's really important to make it a decision, to not just go by default. Because I've already, I already have a PhD, well, obviously I'll go do a postdoc. I already did a postdoc, well, obviously I'll go on the job market. And at no point do people stop and say, wait, is that what I want? Is that the kind of job that I want? And one of the things that I say to people in my lab is that after your postdoc, no matter what, you are going to have a career shift. You basically can't stay a postdoc forever in academia. I mean, you can try to stay a postdoc longer in academia. There are some, research scientist tracks at NIH, for instance, intramural. You can be a research scientist for your whole career, but then you have to switch to that, right? Like the idea of becoming a PI to continue what I did so far, that's just completely false. PIs do not do anything like what you did in your postdoc or in grad school. So as a graduate student and as a postdoc, you mostly do research. PIs mostly don't do research. So the question is really not, do I want to be a PI or not, or do I want to have a lab in the future or not? It's what job do I want to have in the future? Because at the end of your postdoc, you just have to decide, like, which way do you want to go? And one thing to ask yourself is, what do I like most about my job? So if really you're in love with the research and that's the thing that you want to do full time, as the questioner here said, I think being a PI is probably not your best idea. I think there are jobs, like I said, intramural at NIH and at other institutions. You could be a research scientist in a lab. There are jobs in industry, many jobs in industry where you can be a researcher. That is your job. I mean, it's not academic research, but it's the same. It's the same kind of thing. You can work in a pharma company and do neuroscience research. You can work at a data science company and do data science research. I think you could do much more research outside of academia than in academia as a PI in some sense. Because the main thing a PI does, in my view, or one of the main things that is our job description, is training and teaching. So not teaching in the classroom, but teaching our students. And that's something, and our postdocs, and that's something that I realized when the first batch of people were going to leave my lab after, like everything was working, the well-oiled machine, and then they're all graduating and leaving their postdocs. And I just thought, oh my God, I don't feel like starting from scratch with new people. I mean, and how do I keep the knowledge? What do I ask them to document their code and stuff? And then I had this like sudden realization, because in industry I did code and we would have people document before they leave so the next person could just take it from there. And I thought, no, this is completely different. Nobody is coming into the lab to take someone else's code and continue from there. They're coming in to learn from scratch themselves, to code it themselves, to do the experiment themselves. I mean, they're not going to work from someone else's data most of the time. Maybe, their first project, but everybody is coming to do their own learning curve. And so it's like ratchet, like we make progress in science, but every time new students come, we're moving back. That's okay, because our goal is to train them, and when they're trained, they leave. That is their goal, to leave when they're trained. So we're never going to have a lab full of well-trained people who will stay for 20 years. So again, if what you want is to work with a group of well-trained people for 20 years, go work in industry, be a team leader in industry. If you like training people, seeing them grow, seeing them change and learn and blossom into, they're independent researchers, then be a PI. So I think like that's the main question about whether you want to have a lab in the future. Is this the stuff that you love? If you love research, then there are other options that are better for you.
So yeah, I agree and disagree. So the point that I might disagree a little bit on is that PI doesn't necessarily do research anymore, right? So that's to some extent a matter of your own attitude, because there are PIs who deliberately keep their lab very small and are very much hands-on in terms of their mentorship, and you see them at the bench, or you see them coding, or you see them do math, and they still enjoy the day-to-day of the research, and they try to get as much of that in as possible. I also still like it. I don't have enough time for it anymore, but I try to work in and I am actually constantly struggling to keep my lab small enough that I have time for everything, to mentor people and also do some work by myself on the side. So I think it's possible. And I think there's also a cultural...
Yeah, I agree. I also want to say that doing research through the students and through the postdocs is doing research. Like, you know, you meet with them weekly and you help shape their projects. You are doing research. So definitely, I'm not saying you will stop doing research. I'm saying if doing research is the main thing that you love, and you don't love training people, then you're going to be in trouble. And I have colleagues who have left academia after being PIs for many years. And I kind of realized from their stories that they ended up over time hating the training part of it. So I kind of think that's a requirement, right? Like, you know, you should definitely like research if you're staying in research, but like you have to like training if you want to be a PI, because that is one of our main job descriptions.
There is a question in the chat. What about transitioning into being a staff scientist in an academic lab to use your skills for much longer and do amazing science? So I think this depends which academic system you're in. So in the US system, which I'm most familiar with, that can work out great, but it really depends on how well funded the lab is and how good the relationship is with the PI of the lab. Right? So you can be a staff scientist for a very long time, but you will never be truly independent. You will always be under the PI who's leading the lab. So that in some cases that can definitely work, but it's not that you have much potential to grow. And I know many research assistant professors, research associate professors who at some point start feeling stuck in that role and still want to get greater independence.
Also, universities try to discourage, some universities at least, try to discourage that kind of position. I mean, they have that, but they're very, very few and far between. Yeah. Might be even harder to find than a PI position.
Yeah. This might be different in other countries, right? So I grew up in the Netherlands, and even though I left a long time ago, I know that the system is very different. So there you would have the equivalent of lecturer and senior lecturer positions. I know many European countries are like that. And these are stable, relatively independent jobs where you still technically have a boss who is the professor, the big professor. But the big professor only does administration and grant writing, and you can essentially lead your own lab under that professor if they let you. So depending on which country and which system you're in, these considerations might be different.
Should we go to the next question?
Absolutely.
So I'm a female postdoc, mid-30s, and I feel anxious about postponing having kids because I still don't have a stable job and don't feel ready. Sometimes I feel like I should just quit science altogether and have kids just because I don't want to be constantly questioning myself whether I'm choosing to do research at the expense of my own fertility. So that's a huge question that a lot of people have, a lot of women have. And I feel that two main things. One is, if you say, I don't feel ready, so I don't feel ready for what? Feeling ready for having kids. I think anybody here who has kids can attest that I think you never feel ready for having kids. You just do it at some point. When you want to, you just do it. And parenting is a really hard job that we're not trained for at all, which is another, like, you know, I could talk for hours about how I think that education system is failing us because it's not teaching us to be parents, which is probably one of our most important, well, is our most important job in life in some sense, if we choose to be parents. So yeah, so don't wait to be ready to have a child. But the other side of this is, I think it's a false dichotomy that it's either or, and that there's a best time in your career to have a child. So when I was pregnant with my first, I was an assistant professor and sitting on the train commuting, because I used to commute 2 hours a day to my work and back because of two body issues and where my husband worked. And a student came and sat to me next to me at the train one day and said, on the train, and said, I have a question for you. I you know, given that you're going to have a baby, I wanted to ask, do you think the assistant professor time is the optimal time to have a baby? And it's it's good that I didn't have like coffee in my mouth or something, because I would have spit it all out. Like, do you think? I mean, well, first of all, I had been trying for years to have a baby. So you can't plan things as much as you want, as much as you think. So I think, you know, if you want to have a family, just go for it. You don't know how long it will take you. Anyway, I didn't know. I definitely did not plan it that way. That's how it happened. I think, yeah, we overthink the planning of perfection of when it will be the right time. And whether it's career or children, that's a false dichotomy there. I really think, I mean, and people here maybe are mostly from the US. I grew up in Israel. In Israel, all the, you know, my mom, all my friends' moms, all my friends now, or their wives, like all the women work full time. It's just like super common. I never saw anything else. I never thought it should be anything different. I know in the US it's less common. And when I was pregnant, people kept saying, "Oh, what are you gonna do?" And I was like, "What do you mean? I'm gonna have a baby." What do you mean? What am I gonna do? And they're like, "Oh, what are you gonna do with your work?" I don't know, go back to work, like just like everybody, no? So yeah, you're not going to be 100% at anything, but that's like regardless. You won't be the 100% like the best parent in the world, even if you don't have a career. But I think it's really important for children to have happy parents. And if you sacrifice something as big as your career for your child, that is a huge thing to put on their shoulders and a burden for them in the future. So, you know, there will be a few hard years, but once they're 3.5 years old, it starts getting easier, and just pull through. And but the one important thing is your partner. And I think that's kind of, I mean, that's hard to say, but that's the non-negotiable part. If you don't have a supportive partner who will take the load as well, I mean, you know, people have children as single parents. That's totally fine, but know what you're getting into. If you're getting into it, if you want to have a child with a partner together and they are not willing to support you doing that and having a career, rather than swap the career out, I would swap the partner out. I mean, it's really hard to say, but ask yourself, you know, what is my problem here? Is the problem that I think I can't fit the career with the child, or is the problem that I can't fit it with my partner? With my partner's expectations, because someone who's not supporting you in what you want to do, that's a huge problem in your relationship, way above and beyond can you manage to, you know, the like day-to-day caring for a baby and having a job, because it's like, you know, if this career is important for you, you need your partner to support you in that, regardless of even how much money you're making or whatever, if you want them to support what's important for you. So I would say look deep inside and see where the problem really lies. And lots of people do it. So many people, people on tenure track now, I think like probably the modal number is now two children during tenure track. It's just not as rare anymore. It used to be a crazy thing to do. Now everybody does it. So you're not going to be alone. You can do it. Others can do it. You can do it. It's okay. You don't have to give up either.
Irish in the chat is saying academia does allow for time flexibility, which is good to have a child. And that's, I've heard a lot, and I've also experiencing myself now, now that I have a 2-year-old, that it's just so, before the whole pandemic, but under normal circumstances, it's just so convenient that you can move meetings around at will and not have to be work strict hours, and that many deadlines are somewhat flexible. So it's pretty unusual in other occupations than academia, in my impression. So that could definitely be a very good reason why academia and being a parent of young children could go well together.
Also, one word of caution here. So a lot of people on tenure track have children, and I pointed that out to someone, to a colleague, to Anne Churchland, a few years ago in a meeting, and she said, well, you know, because people who have children as postdocs might be in a disadvantaged position in that, you know, when you have a lab, you go out to maternity leave, you can't just not come back. Your lab is there. And they all depend on you. And so there's something pulling you back. And when you're a postdoc and a grad student, but especially a postdoc, because there's no thesis looming, there's not a big pull back. And she was worried that women who have children as postdoc, at the postdoc stage, might drop out of science more than at later stages because there's not this really strong pull. To the contrary, it seems like, oh, you know, you come back to one, the slog, and two, the job market that is really soul crushing. And so, you know, why do I have to do this? Do I really want to do this? So that's a really tough time. So not saying don't have a child when you're a postdoc, but know that it's temporary, that right now it seems like you're dispensable, like you can just drop out of your career and nobody will care. Like if you were 1 or 2 years ahead, you would not be dispensable at all. And you couldn't just like decide, you know what, I'm not going to return back from my maternity leave. And so have that bigger picture and know that you're really, really, really necessary. And lots of people want you to continue, even if it doesn't seem so at that moment, because it's not the structure that you're in right now.
Let's go to the next. I want to write my modeling papers with the complexity and detail they deserve. Advisor only wants simple models for high impact papers. How do you resolve this? So I picked this question not just because I'm a computational modeler myself, but also because I'm reading a bigger theme here, right? That's what do you do if you and your advisor have very different ideas about how to structure a research project and what is a set goal? So the first thing I would like to question is the advisor's presumptions here, that the presumption that having a sophisticated and detailed model does not mean that you can have a high impact paper. Those things are absolutely not mutually exclusive. Yael and we both have papers in high profile journals that do modeling in a sophisticated and detailed ways. So I'm not sure if the advisor really has a realistic view of what kind of modeling would fly. But of course, like the deeper issue here is that the advisor seems to be wanting to take the easy route, the simple model, so that you can get something out relatively quickly, and maybe you can overlook complexities that you might encounter if you start testing more alternative models. And that's just not great science, if you ask me. Right? If you think that something is wrong about your model or about your approach more generally, then within reason you want to dig deeper. Right? You want to say, can I fix what's wrong with it? Can I also challenge my own model? Can I compare it against alternative models? So if you have a good relationship with your advisor, I would definitely push for those things. And in some cases, they might be convinced. Maybe they did not realize that the data didn't allow for this very simple explanation and required something deeper. So you can have a scientific argument. Now, it could also be that the advisor is too product oriented as opposed to really wants to get to the bottom of the question. And that's a difficult situation. You have to then make your own judgment call whether you think this is acceptable, and you can say, well, maybe I publish a simple model now, but then I follow up with another paper in which I go more in depth, and in that way you can have you can have a win-win situation potentially. And in a situation where it really comes to a strong disagreement about whether a paper is ready or needs more work, you might have to consult other PIs. So if you, for example, have a dissertation committee, then other PIs in that committee would typically be the ones you would go to ask for some kind of arbitration in case of such a disagreement, or it could be discussed in a committee meeting.
I'm going to say something that's maybe is a less popular view, but I think when you have, or maybe less common view, so the relationship with your advisor is like a family relationship in some sense, but you don't have to be the child and they the parent. Sometimes you can be the adult. Like, you know, people come with all their complexities, and I think we'll get to that in other questions as well, and your advisor is no different from that. And so trying to understand kind of the underlying motives, and also trying to take the bigger, I mean here, be the adult in taking the longer view picture into consideration. So maybe this person's style is very simple models. That's the kind of things that they want to do. It's kind of tough. They're your advisor, and you kind of have to, in the end, cede to, if they're very strong. I mean, you definitely have the scientific conversation with them, but in some senses, they have the last say because they're bringing in the funding, et cetera. They can say, you know, don't do that experiment or don't spend time on that model. They're your boss in some sense. So just remember that the questions will wait. If you don't do it now, you can do it in your postdoc. You can do it when you're faculty. You can. I've been working on questions that I had when I was a master's student. Nobody will solve it for you in the meantime. Come back 10 years later, most of the questions that you are interested in are still there. If you haven't dived into them, if they're not interesting for you anymore, then fine, then you don't have to do them. Good, you didn't waste time on them in the past. But I'm just saying, if you feel like you're really curtailed in doing what you want to do, think you can do it later. You don't have to do it right now, and it's maybe not worth the huge clash with your advisor. That's one thing. And the other thing, and we'll get to that, because your relationship with your advisor, unfortunately, is one where you need them more than they need you. So think about what's worth the clash. The other thing is there are many ways to succeed in science. Look around at other people. Not everybody does the same thing. So one person might think that a lot of short papers, like one paper, one idea, I don't want to have a lot in a paper, and that's valid. It might not be the way you think about things. You want your paper to be a psych review paper with like all the different results. Your way is right, their way is right too, because they're your advisor. If they're really stubborn, like if they're, you know, if they're open-minded, then they would say, yeah, there are many ways to succeed. You do you, because this is your paper. But if they're not doing that, then it doesn't necessarily mean that they're, you know, bad scientists. It could be that their aesthetic is very different and you kind of signed up for their lab. So go with their aesthetic for a while, learn that way of doing things. And then, you know, as I said, later on, do you, or maybe do a combination because you've gotten convinced. And the last thing I want to say with complex detail is that I feel that as an advisor, one of my big jobs is to teach students. I think when you're less well-trained, you tend to find complexity in everything. The models are very complex, the experiments are very complex. I think simplifying things and seeing kind of the line of, you know, understanding that goes through the model rather than all the details, that is part of learning. So it might be that it seems to you that your advisor doesn't want the complexity because it's messy and because of aesthetics and things like that, but it might also be that they're saying something really fundamentally correct about the science, and that complex detail is not necessary and obfuscates what the model is doing, and just, you know, you can fit any curve with a model with enough complexity. So this might actually be the right scientific thing that you should take from their advice.
Yeah, that could go both ways, right? Like how the saying goes, you want to make your model as simple as possible, but not simpler. The way that I read the questioner's statement is that the advisor's motive for keeping the model simple is not because that's scientifically the most appropriate, but because it would produce a potentially higher impact paper.
That's right, but I'm saying that might be in the eyes of the student. I mean, the advisor does have many years of experience in that field, so give them the benefit that maybe what they're saying is also scientifically valid, and take it as a learning opportunity.
I wanted to riff off of your earlier comment on how you can manage up, and I've definitely had students who managed me up. So I had one student, this was a bit of a reverse situation where I thought that certain analysis still needed to be done, and the student thought that the paper was done and that we could save the remaining analyses for future work. And he was very well prepared and came to the meeting with 5 points. And those 5 arguments together, they were convincing enough that I gave up. And I said, you go ahead, you have it your way, this is convincing. And since then, it's been a bit of a meme in my lab. That's, if you want to convince Weiji, you have to bring 5 arguments. Shall we go to the next question?
Yeah. So I made this so small that I can't see the little letter. Okay, so this one's mine. We have our secret code. So how can you avoid a powerful person ruining your career if you fall out with them? How do you deal with this, with there always being an implicit threat if you don't do what they want? And a very related question, a former advisor has turned spiteful and competitive after I changed labs. He's a big shot, so that was totally unexpected. I would like to have a recommendation letter from him for my next job application, but I'm quite hesitant now after observing his behavior. Why would a person with a permanent position compete with an early career researcher belonging to a minority group? What would your advice be for this situation? Have you experienced something similar in the past? So this is what I was alluding to already before. This is a really tough situation, both these situations. And many people are in those. The advisor-advisee relationship is a really important one, because ideally you will have this advisor support your career for years and years. I still ask for letters from my PhD advisor. And it's really hard. So I'll say first one thing, a lot of people fall out with their advisor kind of mildly at the end of their thesis time. Like I could see it with many people when I was a PhD student. I felt like it was like adolescence. Like you need to kind of feel like, oh, I've learned so much from this person that I now need to challenge everything they say in order for you to move on. That's okay. You did, like, you know, manage that, know that that happens, and don't let it actually ruin your relationship. That's like the mild thing. But there are situations, as described here, that are much bigger than that. People who try to stop you from moving ahead, who really try to ruin your career or block your career. And that is really tough. I don't have, you know, there's no magic answer to this. And you might be screwed in some sense. I would say, why would people do this? You'd be amazed how the most successful people still have imposter syndrome, still think that they're not good enough, still think they have to compete with everybody. People become very successful without losing their insecurities at all. And so you could imagine the insecurities that you have, you know, hopefully that would change with time, but know that a bunch of people around you, they kept those insecurities all along. And I've seen it on some of my colleagues and people in the field that it took me a while to realize, you know, why are they so combative? Why? And then I realize it's whenever they feel threatened, and it's like, oh my God, this is a joke. They feel threatened. I mean, this person is like, you know, everything that they say is like considered like gold, but they still feel threatened, and you can't deny someone's internal feelings. And once you put that lens on it, suddenly it makes sense of a lot of their behavior. So again, manage up, try to be the adult in the room, try to like make, you know, clear that you're not threatening them, but it's not really your job as a trainee. It's like, it's really tough if you're working with someone who feels threatened by your success. Like I said, with the partner that, you know, lose the partner that's not supporting you. I wish you could just lose that advisor. So sometimes you can find other advisors. You don't always have to continue. You don't have to continue your PhD in the same lab. It's a huge cost, but you don't have to continue the PhD in the same lab if it's really toxic. You can do a second postdoc if your first postdoc ended up toxic. You can finish your PhD, but then, like, you know, you only need their letter to get into a postdoc, and from then on, never ask them for letters again. You know, if someone is going to write bad letters for you, do not ask them for letters. And there are ways to find this out. One is sometimes people tell you, you know, this person is not doing you a favor. Don't ask for letters from them. So just don't. When I ask people to write letters for me, I always give them a really easy out. So I say something like, you know, you could say something like, I really need, you know, this is very competitive. I need a very strong letter. Hey, I'm hoping you could write one for me, but I totally, you know, this is a last minute request. I totally understand if you don't have time. So I say that not so that not because I think they don't have time, but so they don't have to say, well, I don't think I can write a really strong letter for you. They can just say, yeah, I don't have time, sorry. So give them an easy out to make sure that they can get out rather than write a letter that will hurt you. But yeah, this is tough. That warn other people. You know, even if you had to take a hard blow and have to like work around this and explain. And I've also seen people's applications where they explain why they did not get a letter from somebody, and you could do that. But then help spread the word out, because if someone is doing that to their trainees, if someone is competing with them rather than helping them, help other trainees know that, because people don't know that in advance and they continue going to these labs. And so these are very successful people who just hurt trainee after trainee. And it's like, why is this not a known thing? It's known, often it will be known to their colleagues. So you think, oh, if I don't get a letter from X, it will look really weird, but everybody knows that X does this to their trainees. So you can write in your application, you know, I didn't get a letter from X because of personal reasons. And people will be like, yep, got it. We know that does not reflect on you, it reflects on them.
Completely agree. So this is one of my biggest problems with the academic system, that it's almost feudal, right? It's like medieval Europe, where you have a noble who is like at the top of the pyramid, and then the peasants have to work for this person and pay homage to them, and are pretty much lifelong dependent on that person. It's a strange and potentially toxic system with way too few checks and balances on the power dynamics. So I completely agree on that. And I've, in my own experience, seen a lot of cases where somebody falls out with the advisor, usually because the advisor is a toxic mentor, right? So that could be because they are always negative, or even when the person's in the lab, they already are competitive, or there's neglect, that they never pay attention to the student, or they don't even remember what the person is working on and constantly change their minds. There's many ways in which these advisor-advisee relationships can go wrong, and in most cases it's actually the advisor's fault. And in those cases, if it's still early on, you can indeed switch labs. And I've counseled students on that, and I've even taken some of those in my own lab, and it worked out well. And it's definitely an option that should be on the table if you still have 2, 3, 4 years to go with the toxic advisor. And in some cases, this was done with, actually, I cannot imagine a case where the student wouldn't be very afraid to consider that possibility, because they will always wonder if if the original advisor is going to sabotage their careers. And that's a real and legitimate fear. And the only way around that is to keep believing in yourself and finding allies. And so you have to also find, you can get a good recommendation letter from your new advisor. Now, if you're in a situation where you've already stayed in that lab for a long time and you just decide to finish it, and then you still depend on getting the letter from that bad advisor, then sometimes it's still possible that if you know that you're not going to get a good letter from them, that you would talk to another professor. Okay, this is similar to what I was saying. That people have and asked me, could I write a letter for them, even though I had not directly supervised them, but because I knew their personal situation, right? And can say something about what happened between, I can then say something about what happened between the student and the advisor, and explain that it was not the student's fault, and that the student actually did very good work, but because of a bad mentorship situation, they were not able to ask the original advisor for a letter. And I think that can mitigate the damage to some extent. I think it's still far from ideal, but combined with what you were saying, Yael, about bad advisors often having a reputation, it might be that you can still put your career back on the rails. And I think I cannot emphasize enough allies, right? So you can sometimes talk to a trusted other PI. You can talk sometimes to the director of graduate studies or somebody equivalent in your department. Sometimes there's a chair or vice chair of your department who you can talk about this. And it's true that part of talking about it might not be just for yourself, but also for generations of students after you. Right? Like, so what you said, Yael, is very true, that you almost wish that there was some kind of black book of advisors who might look great to work with on the surface if you just look at their science, but everybody who joins their lab is miserable. Then new students should be warned against that. This actually relates to a question that came up in the chat, and that's raised a discussion. Samuel Picard was bringing up how to incentivize mentorship. It's a really important question. It's also a really big topic. So since we are almost out of time, I'm thinking we should save this for another session to give this the attention that it deserves. I also see a lot of other really good points in the chat, and I will save the chat and we will go through and see what we can address in future instances.
I wanted to say two things from the chat. One quick thing, people are saying about the Whisper Network, and when you come to visit a lab, people in the lab often won't tell you things. Well, I think that's correct. And so try to talk to people who have graduated from the lab. They have the best perspective. First of all, they've seen the whole process. You know, people in the lab, if this person only becomes nasty once you leave the lab, everybody in the lab doesn't know that yet, right? So you really want to talk to people who have left. And I have not been shy about that. When I was interviewing for my postdoc, I asked the advisor, who should I talk to? Who do you recommend of the people who have left your lab that I talked to? Specifically, I was changing from computational to experimental. So I said, you know, has there anybody who has made that shift that I can talk to? But you could just ask for recommendations of who to talk to, or just look at the list and contact them. Why are we relying on a Whisper network and not a black book and not, this is a really big question, and as Weiji said, we don't have time to get into it, but I want to say something about this because I feel that students feel and postdocs feel very kind of abandoned by the fact that this is not baked into the system better. I've been thinking about this a lot for years. I don't know that there's a good way to bake it into the system. It's, you know, like peer review. there's no perfect way to do it. It could be so rife with, you know, how can you unprove something? You know, people who are competing with you scientifically can say you're a bad mentor to try to get students to not come to you. Like, all kinds of things can happen. It's really hard to undo a blacklisting or to prove, and it's always a two-way relationship. I mean, some people are just scumbags. I won't say that's not the case, but in many cases, you know, I have great relationships with most people in my lab, but I've had a few relationships that went really sour. Does that make me a terrible advisor? That if you ask that person, they would say I'm a terrible advisor. So I think it's really hard to make this to make this work the way we all want it to work. So it's not that you're being abandoned and nobody cares about what you think. I think nobody has a good solution for it. And maybe we'll find out one in the future that's better than the Whisper Network. But just wanted to throw out that it's a really complicated issue.
Certainly. So we will save this question for next time. And right now my keynote is stuck, but I just wanted to go to the remaining concluding slide, which was a thank you for attending here today, this meeting today. And the recording we will post on the...
Weiji, can I just interject to that? That last question that was asked was actually asked on Twitter and got a ton of great replies on Twitter and resources. So please go and read that thread if you're interested in. This is a question about what happens if you're feeling apathetic to your science, either now with COVID or just in general, because it happens to lots of people at different points in time. And there were really, really good answers there. Lots of points of view. Of course, each point of view, you know, today you heard from Weiji and from me, this is just two people's points of view. There's nothing magical about our experience compared to other people's. But that question already has a lot of good answers.
And you can find it by looking for Celia's handle on Twitter, CogCelia. We'll post a recording. If you have follow-up questions, then definitely submit them through the website, growingupinscience.com. And I just want to do a quick poll to see who here would be interested in more events like that. So could you raise your hand or type in the chat if you're interested
there's a raise hand feature.
Yeah,
I think like we can't see all your hands right now because there are too many of you. So just put it like if
okay, but I'm like, seeing, I would say
like 57, 58 raise their hand. Yeah. It's,
okay, all right, you're keeping track. Okay, good.
Well,
so then definitely if it's up to me, we'll see this, that we're going to try to do this again. Thank you so much for sharing your questions, your personal experiences, advice with other people in the chat, and being like a participant in these really important conversations. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you. We hope to see you in the next event. Take care.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Weiji, for organizing this.
Thank you, Yael.
Bye-bye.